Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I am Sam Mulberry.
I'm Amy Poppinga.
And we are back after Exam 1.
Yes.
We're deep into Unit 2.
Deep into Unit 2, my favorite unit,
Yes.
I think.
But before we dive into Unit 2, let's one last farewell to Unit 1.
Goodbye, Unit 1.
Feedback from exams.
Yeah, no, I think overall, I don't know if I scared people away from sending me emails that said I didn't have enough time, but I didn't get any.
I think this might be the first test where maybe Chris did, but neither of us received any emails. People just took the test.
People just took the test. Went, wow, we did not have any logistical issues or technological issues, which again, wow.
Yeah,
and so I don't want to jinx it. Yeah, knock on veneer.
I feel like this has been the best technological summer of all.
I am going to agree with that. Yes. And so that's awesome. So I appreciate people's efforts to, if you have had glitches or problems with the museum, in fact, the only person who's had it massive technological glitch has been me, which my students know what that's about, as does Sam. But I so appreciate when people just take a minute to kind of troubleshoot, problem solve as it relates to the museums, whatever. However, back to kind of the point of how did Exam 1 go, overall really well. Due to that technical snafu, I am still entering exam grades. So I probably am not as much, or I'm not in the best position to say, and here's my summary assessment of how it went overall, but actually good. I think the feedback I give on essays is consistent with things we said before. It's just, save enough time for it, and please, please, please use specific examples. Like really try to look at your writing and say, okay, if I wasn't in the class, and like, am I using a lot of insider info here, or am I actually setting up the examples that I am talking about? Just be specific.
And I think I can speak for all of us that there were lots of comments written on essays. So it's not just we give you a grade, but we're really telling you, here's the things. And I know I wrote at the end of a lot of my comments, this is about making you better for your next essay.
Yep. Nope, that's absolutely right. So, and I do think that's the hard part with online a little bit, is that the only real interaction you feel like you have is these webisodes, but then this written feedback. And so sometimes if you're just getting that written feedback, it can feel overly critical, and it's not meant to. It's meant to just try to actually be really clear so that the feedback is useful to you. A big part of the Middle Ages Museum, Sam, kind of transitioning here, thinking about the museum that we've
Let's get into it.
Get into the museum. So now we are having, hopefully the museums are routine to you now. You look forward to them. You enjoy them. One of my favorite part of grading museum assignments is what was most interesting to you. I always really like that. I
forget about stuff that's in there, and someone will bring up
and it's like, that's awesome. Yes, and I think the thing I value about that most, which I know I've said to some of the students in my feedback, is there's super cool things that we get to cover through the museums that we just don't have time for in the regular semester. And often it's a lot of that frosting. It's stuff about culture. It's stuff about daily life. And I really like that. And art, and just a lot more about daily life and what it would have been like. But a big part of the Middle Ages is the sacraments. So students, hopefully you are familiar as I say sacraments, what I'm talking about here, very ritualistic types of ways of pursuing grace and pursuing forgiveness. Sam, what do 21st century Protestants tend to misunderstand, would you say, about the sacraments? And I guess maybe we're asking you that question. You grew up in a Catholic, in the Catholic tradition.
13 years of Catholic school education.
13 years of Catholic school education. I think sometimes, depending upon different types of Christian experiences, either number one, maybe CWC is actually the first time students have even heard of the sacraments if you didn't have any connections with Catholicism. And so I also think that sometimes non-Catholic Christian communities can be maybe hypercritical of things that seem too traditional or too ritualistic. So what in the 21st century do you think that we can, I guess start with, what do Protestants misunderstand about them, would you say?
I think what's really powerful about them, and maybe this is a way to get at this, is that it's a way of connecting this notion of grace, which is really powerful, but often not super tangible, and applying it to the physical. The sacraments are physical, right? I mean, there's something powerful about communion, and lots of churches do communion, right? That's a pretty common Christian thing. But if you tie it to sort of the sacred if you just open yourself up to the what if this really is the body of Christ? What would it mean to walk up to the front of a church and walk up to someone who offers you something and says, this is the body of Christ broken for you? And just imagine for a moment if it really was.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so it's tying that into the physical. No, I think the hard part...
It's hard to think of walking up there with a cup of coffee to go.
Right. Churches I grew up in, you don't get snacks, I think the other big thing is it gets so tied in when people are critical of the sacraments. And I'm not saying this isn't even a valid criticism, but it's often put in terms of, why should I have to go to a priest to confess my sins? Why should I have to do this? And I think if you want to imagine the sacraments, take out the have to. And just think about, well, why might it be important to confess your sins to someone, to ask for forgiveness, to show contrition? Take out you have to, but just think about that. Like, that's kind of what if you were open to the fact that miracles can happen, and maybe the Mass is a miracle. I mean, that's how it's viewed in the Catholic lens. So I think it endows this world with the spiritual more. And I think as 21st century Christians, products of the Enlightenment scientific revolution, that's Unit 3 stuff we'll get to, like, our world's just not terribly magical. And I think, and I don't mean magical in like a silly, playful way. I mean like it's not imbued with the Spirit to a lot of us.
Well, I think our culture isn't.
Certainly.
I don't know that I think
what I would say is our view of the world then is often through this lens. That's why I'm always amazed when I talk with students who didn't grow up in America, either students who are come from Africa, or students who grew up as missionary kids. So like, they've seen the world through lenses that aren't Western lenses, and it's so interesting because they seem far more open to things, or they'll tell stories and you're like, whoa, and it's actually convicting to me to realize, like, oh yeah, I'm pretty scientific in the way I look at the world.
No, very cool. Agreed as well. Mm-hmm.
Amy, one more point of confusion. Would you clarify the difference between feudalism and manorialism? So these are two big terms.
Two big terms. Yes, I totally will. So we are going to take it simple, make it a little bit more detailed and broad, and then bring it on back to the simple. So these are two of the guiding hierarchical systems that guide life in the Middle Ages that would have affected everyone. Whether you were at the lowest end of the socioeconomic ladder, or whether you were at the wealthier end, or anywhere in between, everybody would have been in Western Europe. You would have been a part of these two systems that were sort of the guiding systems for how to organize life and how to bring structure. And we know that a big part of the Middle Ages is about recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire, a search for security. And so, put simply, these two systems are meant to provide security and stability. And so, if we want to take the system of manorialism first, so manorialism is the system of, well, like an easy way to understand it is what we call the economic system for how life was structured. So the manor system, that people are mostly living in these close-knit communities on a larger bit of land that would be owned by the wealthy landowner, the lord of the manor, that they're set up communally to mostly around agricultural pursuits. So everybody is working in the fields, growing food. Monetary structures have sort of fallen apart. So you're not getting paid a monetary wage at the end of the week. Instead, in exchange for the work that you're doing, working the land that's all owned by the lord of the manor, you get to live in a dwelling on the manor, and you get to keep a certain amount of the produce or the grains that have been produced. Your wife can go and make bread at the communal mill. So you get to kind of utilize all of these different pieces of infrastructure that are sort of owned by the lord of the manor, and you work essentially in exchange for the security of that bigger system. So you are not an independent farmer. You're kind of communally doing this type of labor together. And so the majority of society is really like, the majority are here at the bottom. If we want to think about this like a triangle, like the very wealthy and powerful are up here in the smallest part of the triangle. And then as the population, as you get towards this bottom, that's where the majority would be. people are peasants, is a common term for them, that are living off of the land and are working in exchange for having that economic security, being provided with food and being provided with a job and some level of stability. Let's layer over that of our like hierarchical Middle Ages triangle, like another triangular layer. So this is not a completely separate system. This is one that goes over it. So we've got like our living economic, monetary, or not monetary, but economic system. Then we have feudalism, and feudalism is the political system. So put simply, this is sort of the unseen. This isn't really something that you can observe, but rather the political guiding system for the time period. And so the way the feudal system works, same thing with the triangle. Authority is up here. The person at the top of that triangle is the king, essentially, who the king, underneath him, there are lords that are those wealthy landowners. The king grants land to these wealthy landowners in order for those wealthy landowners to pledge their loyalty back up to the king. And they protect all of those people who live here at the bottom on their manor by paying and paying through the form of also like land rights and gifts, knights and vassals. And knights and vassals are people who have been trained to essentially protect. They're kind of a slightly higher class than everybody who's here at this peasant level. So it's this system of, again, kind of like building up towards the top. The political system is based on this pledges of loyalty. So the peasants are sort of pledging their loyalty up to the Lord. The Lord is protecting them with the knights and the vassals. The knights and vassals are pledging their loyalty to the Lord, and ultimately the Lord is pledging his loyalty to the king. And when the king needs something from these people, wants a certain decision, wants to make a certain, sort of type of move, needs an army built, and needs those lords to send their knights and vassals, then this is where like the political favors and trades come in. You agree with me? I will continue to, protect your land. I will give you more land. This sort of system of exchange. So here at the peasant level, you don't really have a say in that. I mean, it's not like you're voting on anything, but this is sort of the system of protection that is keeping that manorial system secure, stable, functioning. The main thing I always try to emphasize is that there's no individuality really within the manorial or feudal system. Nobody's like going rogue and saying, I'm going to save up my pennies and open my own shop. We're going to buy our own land. Like that's not...
No mobility.
There's no mobility. So you don't sort of start out as a peasant and say, how do I pull myself up by the bootstraps, work my way up the ladder, and wind up being a wealthy lord? Like,
it's interesting to think like what movies would be like if they made movies at that time, because so much of like our pop culture in America is about mobility,
right?
Like, here we are.
Yeah, you can work your whole life and you're never going to get anywhere. And so life is very day to day. I mean, it's like, what do I need to do to survive today? How do I keep my family alive? How do I keep disease at bay? How do I keep them fed? And so, yeah, there's not a mentality of like generational wealth and working your way up the ladder and leaving things better for those who come after you. It is truly like, you're kind of down to the basics in a way. But to bring it all back, manorial system is the economic kind of social system, and feudalism is the political system, the system of authority and power. Does that help?
That's great.
Thanks.
We finally figured it out. So.
Yes. All right. So, Sam, you have traveled quite a bit throughout Europe. You and Professor Gerritz do this World War I travel trip, which is really popular. And so, do you have any tourist advice for us? What's your favorite medieval site you've visited in Europe?
I'm going to name 3. 2 are easy to get to. One's a little bit harder.
Okay.
If you're in London, it can feel a little cheesy, but the Tower of London is really one of the most CWC haunted places. And I mean haunted just by like the number of people we talk about that have been there. So I mean, it's built during right after Hastings is 1066. It's built in 1090. So it's William the Conqueror era, the initial construction. You have all kinds of medieval stuff there. You have all kinds of Renaissance, Reformation stuff there. You have scientific revolution stuff there. Isaac Newton lived there. It's really cool. Like just everything is there in terms of English history. So that's pretty cool. If you're in Paris, one of my favorite sites in the world, about an hour train trip out of Paris, this is the harder one to get to, is Chartres Cathedral.
I wish we had Dr. Gerritz here for French.
That's right.
Pronunciation.
It's going to get worse. Yes. And it's my favorite church in the world. It's amazing. When we talk about Gothic cathedrals, like it is,
and you can in the museum. You can see
elements of it. The stained glass is amazing.
Yeah.
It's just a really cool place. But if you can't make the hour trip out of Paris, my favorite place in Paris is Saint-Chapelle. I'm trying to do my best. Yeah, it's this small Gothic chapel, royal chapel, built in 1248, and it's one of the most magnificent. It's small, but one of those most magnificent places I've ever been. So,
oh, very cool!
Yeah.
Wow, note those down for your European travels. Every so often, in any of the classes I teach, I come across a phrase or a term or a name, and I think, man, that is a great band name. And I feel like Flying Buttresses from the cathedral show, like that would be a great. Wouldn't that be a good? Wouldn't you go see the Flying Buttresses?
Maybe. It depends what kind of band they are.
What kind of band do you think they are?
Maybe one I wouldn't love. I don't know.
I kind of think they're like a banjo-based folk group.
Yeah, they might be too pretentious, though, with a name like that.
Well, but maybe it's ironic.
It keeps circling back,
yeah,
right?
It does.
All right,
anyway.
Amy, last topic here. Throughout the textbook, Bachman treats the experiences of Muslims as part of the history of the West, right? And this is an area of study for you. Is that appropriate? Is Islam part of Western culture during the Middle Ages?
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer a big fat yes here, like as big as can be. One of the reasons actually that we, there are many reasons we actually transitioned from the textbook we used to use to the Bachman text. We like it quite a bit. We really like Clifford Bachman's writing style and the way he's organized things. But one of the things I really value about the Bachman text is the inclusion of Islam as a shaping factor in whether it is overt through actual interaction with Muslims, as we look at the expansion of Islam up into what's present-day Spain, mainly, although Islam is also going to spread throughout what is Eastern Europe, all the way as far over as Vienna in Austria. So, number one, geographically, Muslims were actually in Europe during the period of the Middle Ages, and it's not just that reality, but it's also the maybe covert or not as observable ways that Islam has an influence through writers and through philosophers, some of whom we will be exposed to as the second unit goes on. So there is, maybe people are already familiar in their college studies with what's called Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations argument, which is the notion that the West, however we want to define that, and he defines that, I think, pretty broadly, has always been in conflict with Islam. Like he sees Islam as being something that is always historically been in conflict with the West, Western ideology, Western expressions of religion, Western expressions of government and social systems. And I, as a historian of Islam, don't agree with that. And I think there is one of the reasons I actually like studying Islam from a historical perspective is looking at, I think, specific historical examples that work against that particular theory. An author that I really like, James Smith, who is a professor of Middle Eastern studies, says, culture isn't like billiard balls. It's not like, you look at a pool table and you shoot the cue ball and then each one of those balls bounces right off each other. He says culture is permeable and religions are permeable and relationships are permeable. And so as cultures and traditions, ethnic traditions, again, religious traditions, come in contact with each other, they meld into and out of. And Smith doesn't say this, but I'm going to own this. What I say to students is that building on that idea of it not being like billiard balls, I actually think it's more like a lava lamp. Okay, so throwback to the 70s, but thinking of how like in a lava lamp, there's all these blobs, and we can think of like a huge blob like the West, and maybe we think of like, I don't know, the Islam blob as being this big, but it's like at some point they kind of merge and then like all these other little blobs pull off, and like that's happening all the time throughout history. So I think that's a better way of understanding it. So I like Bachman because I think he has more of the lava lamp blob approach, which is that like, no, Islam comes in and it doesn't take it over, but it certainly leaves a little bit. And then as it moves back out, well, number one, it's going to leave things there permanently, but the parts of it that might move back out are bringing with them pieces of the West and influences of the West. So big fat yes, lava lamp.
So the 2018 award for best analogy goes to Amy Poppinga and the lava lamp analogy. We'll be right back with Make the Case. Well, welcome back. It is time for Make the Case Round 2.
Round 2.
Amy, I just by one vote in one of the categories beat you last time. Now you won food chain.
I did win food chain.
Yeah, so it's been a summer of back and forth.
It has indeed.
All right, so the first question, Amy, make the case. Hildegard of Bingen had a mystical experience of God. So I believe this is true or false.
Is this true or false? Tough.
Should we say true goes first? Whoever gets true goes first?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Oh. What does doing that do? Just
it opens
it?
Oh, all right.
Yay. I was when I knew that these were our options today, I was already like going, okay, I'm going to get false, and here's the things I'm going to say. True. Okay, so building a bit on what you said in our first segment about the fact that our world doesn't sort of have enough of the magical or the mystical in it, and as you said, not thinking per se about like, I don't know, magical may be the way we would define it today. But something that teaching Hildegard has really challenged me to do, to your point in Unit 1, is to say, how scientific am I in terms of rooting my religion in a very scientific frame of viewpoint within my particular American culture, and even within, I want to say, like the culture of this state, which I think is a very sort of pragmatic, like Scandinavian background, very pragmatic, very much based on that which can be proved to be true, can carrying on with systems that work, systems that especially work for the whole, like whatever we can agree upon as the whole is clearly sort of what the best solution is. Here's what I really value about Hildegard. On first glance, when you read Hildegard's vision, it's like, what? This is crazy. I mean, if I came in here today and I said, Sam, guess what? On my ridiculously long commute to try to attempt to get to Bethel, God spoke to me in this way and revealed to me, and then I relayed to you something that's otherworldly and something that is doesn't really make sense with the way that something, say, like if we think of Hildegard's vision, the way that a bride netting humans in and out, bride giving birth through the mouth, whatever would actually work. I think you would think I was crazy. And I would think you were crazy. So, I mean, we don't come into class and say, students, guess what? I just had a vision. And they go, oh, okay, great. Share that with us. However, why I think this matters and why I regard it as, quote, true that this is a mystical encounter with God is that one of the things I see as a connecting point in history is that I believe that part of the power of God and part of God's sort of omnipresent nature is that God is always working and speaking to like what is happening in a particular culture. I mean, that's one of the points of our whole course is that God speaks to culture and that God works through the culture to speak to what's going to make sense at that time. And so what I see in this is that we have a culture where for women in particular, and I do think gender actually plays a huge role in Hildegard's experience, is that while Hildegard has some level of authority in the greater kind of systematized structure of the church, she is a nun, well-respected one, runs a successful abbey. At the same time, women don't get to interact with God in the same way. Women aren't viewed as significant spiritual authorities. A woman is not going to be pope. A woman can't hold any of the higher responsibilities within the church, and certainly like a woman is not going to be viewed in the same way. Women's rights are really limited. I mean, there's no women's rights. The notion of rights is not really something that even existed at the time. So I do believe that God is not limited by the human, political, social, economic, legal structures and customs that are put in place by fallen people. So this is, to me, one of the beautiful things about looking at, say, like religious slave experiences during the antebellum period in the South. It's one of the fascinating things about looking at somebody like Perpetua. It's one of the amazing things about your point earlier about hearing from Christians in other cultures where they aren't necessarily cultures that are literate, cultures that can stop by a Lifeway Books and be like, which one of the 30 devotionals should I choose from? Which one of the Sunday sermon podcasts do I download? That God is not limited by what we have access to, that God is not limited by. It's great that we should, in our culture, take advantage, pursue education, things like that, but we're not limited by what structures are in place. So to me, visions is a way in which God is like running into, not God, but rather like culture's running into a wall with the ways in which humans can have a sense of equality with God and a sense of relationship with God. And God is like, well, then I'll just like move around that system and go about it a different way. And I'm going to like give you authority, and I am going to go ahead and I'm going to speak directly to you because I'm not limited by the structures that have been put in place that aren't of my creation. So I think that it's valid. I think that it is, it's affirming of the church, so it's not radical and rogue in the sense that it wasn't saying, hey, this whole system of hierarchy is bunk. Rather, it was actually affirming, and it was teaching. It was a teaching tool, and it also, again, sort of affirmed even though it's a hierarchical system, a type of equality. So to me, true.
All right, well, I got false, and I think false is a lot. It's very hard to argue right now. I actually think you made a really great argument there. So I was trying to think, how would I argue false? Because I will say I don't like the thought of saying well, yeah, you say that's your experience, but here I am, 800 years later, sorry, and I'm going to tell you what's really real. I don't feel comfortable with that. So what I want to say, instead of saying why I think she's false, I want to try to figure out why is it that I think a lot of us want to say false. I want to think about it that way. And maybe this will lead you to say, yeah, it isn't. I think we feel uneasy. And this is to the point you made, really. Like, we feel uneasy sometimes hearing that, like, oh, God spoke to this person, and it's like, because then that opens the door up to continued revelation. It's like, well, is Scripture our authority? Well, or what supersedes what? I mean, if God says something in the year 1150, now that's later than Scripture being written, so does that supersede Scripture? If God really did it, so we feel uneasy about that, right? We like clean answers, to your point, right? So we feel uneasy about that. We also, I'm often critical of our scientific worldview when I say, like, oh, we see the world too scientifically, but part of why the scientific revolution wasn't a blip on the radar screen in the 1600s, and then we moved on from that, even though we are living in a world which I think in lots and lots of ways, in frightening ways, is very postmodern, right? We're past viewing the world scientifically. Yeah. We're still rooted to truth found in science, because I think there's truth in that too. So part of me wants to say, I'm uneasy with saying, yes, she had this experience from God, because that opens the door up to a lot of other things which become deeply problematic. And I think, I guess I should use I statements, right, instead of we statements. I sometimes feel uncomfortable with the lack of clarity that saying true to her experience would bring. Because I need to wrestle with, well, what does her vision mean? So if she had the vision, is her interpretation of the vision correct?
Right.
If it is, what does that mean about the fact that the church that I am part of now doesn't look like what she's describing, right? So I guess I need to discredit it then. Right. Or I need to somehow contextualize it or couch it. So it's easier to say false. And I think that's why we have a tendency to want to say it's not real, right? It's easier to say false. It's easier to explain it in some other way.
Well, and I think, to your point, there are certainly, now I'm helping make your case, is that there's certainly multiple examples, not just in the last century, but probably even in the last 20 years, even just sticking with American culture, like American history, where we can point to people who believed they had visions from God, and they lead to utter death and destruction and discrimination and hurt and abuse and all. And so do we mark visions as having been true if we think, well, they didn't actually hurt anybody? And also your point really makes me think about how do we decide what we put in a particular context? What do we say if that vision that Hildegard had at the time doesn't hold true for you today or doesn't have meaning for you today? Does it mean it? Yeah, I think you won this one. Well, I bet.
Luck of the draw, right? All right, what is our second question? Our second question is, Thomas Aquinas is the greatest Christian theologian since Augustine, true or false? We will have True go first.
Okay.
I'm not even sure which one I want for this.
Oh, I know which one I want, and I don't think I... Oh, I know, yeah. I have too much... I don't have a good poker face. I'm just like, I don't want to get...
All right. Take it away. Thomas Aquinas is the most important Christian theologian since Augustine. He's definitely... I think it's hard to argue that he's not the biggest philosophical, theological figure from Augustine until his time. That anyone in that middle period, I mean, we can name people. We can talk about Boethius, or we can talk about Anselm. We can talk about those folks. I'm just going to name drop here, but they're just not.
Give me something to work with.
Yeah, they're just not. They're not that powerful. Now, what this question is asking is since Augustine to today.
Oh, is that
So
what
yes,
it's asking?
yes. I believe so.
Okay, well, let's go that. Let's
Okay, because
interpret
that
the
gives you a lot more to
question
work
that
with.
way.
So
Let's
I need to
interpret the
say
question that way.
that it basically goes Jesus, Paul, Aquinas.
Okay.
We're done.
Okay, that is going to help.
You feel better?
Yeah,
All
I
right.
do, because I was like,
I think I'm going to
should
lose
have read
this
up
one
on my
too.
Boethius. How do you say it?
Boethius.
Boethius.
Yes.
I
I think I'm going to lose this one too, but he is a monumental figure for thinking about the Middle Ages, and we can say, well, the Middle Ages was the past, but we're talking about. He's monumental even to the time before him. I would say from the Middle Ages to Aquinas, we're building this body of knowledge. Now, what Aquinas is really important for, and I think students miss this, is this notion of medieval synthesis, right? And synthesis means sort of the tying together of things. And throughout the Middle Ages, they're building systems. We talked before about hierarchies. They're building hierarchies, feudal hierarchies, manorial hierarchies, church hierarchies of existence, this great chain of being. And what Aquinas does, hierarchies of knowledge, what Aquinas does is he says, okay, we have all of these different hierarchical understandings, and there is this sense that it all ties together. And what Aquinas does is this bold move of saying, I'm going to write the book that ties it all together, right? The Summa Theologica, right? The totality of all theology, of all knowledge. That's a pretty ambitious, I mean, if we're thinking about band names, that's a great album title, right? Like, I'm just going to sum it all up, right? The Summa Musica.
Yeah.
Right? This is all, everything tied to. And so that's an ambitious project. And he kind of, to the medieval mind, pulls it off, right? That he does find all these interconnections. So I would say, too, if we're looking everything behind him to him, he is the monument. He's the pinnacle that we're building up to. So then we need to think about going forward. He's deeply significant in terms of shaping Catholic theology to this very day. I mean, Catholic theology is Thomistic in lots and lots of ways. He's also this monumental philosophical figure even beyond. So I'm gonna drop some names that I think you might throw into the mix here. So you can talk about Luther or Calvin or people like that as like, well, these are really important theologians, things like this. But if you're taking a survey of philosophy course, you're going to encounter Aquinas. You're going to encounter Augustine. You're going to encounter Aquinas. They may or may not tip their hat to Calvin and Luther, but and now this is saying theologian, and I'm aware that I'm making but that's part of it, is that his theological work is so vast and so broad that it's not just theology. It's about these other things, and his thoughts still matter in those other areas. So I think he really does, to a certain degree, pull off for the medieval mind that idea of the Summa. Now, again, we're wrestling a lot with science in this episode. Now, the scientific revolution is going to, in the same way it tears apart Aristotelian science, that's also, I mean, the foundation of his philosophy is very Aristotelian, a lot, and Christian and Aristotelian, so that's going to tear apart elements of Aquinas. But it's interesting that we look to Aquinas. We continue to look to Aquinas, even though we don't really continue to look to Aristotle in terms of science. So I think Aquinas has lived on there. So I really do think he's so monumental in his time, and the fact that he still has this kind of relevance is where I would make the case for that.
Yeah. Well, okay. Good argument. Totally agree that he's more than just a theologian in terms of the way he is truly offering a systematized view of theology that's going to have resonance in culture, make sense in culture, as relevant today as it was then. We certainly have not gotten rid of our Thomas Aquinas. It's interesting because my first instinct was to go the whole Erasmus and Luther and then Calvin route. However, because...
You gonna go Boethius, please?
No, I'm not going to go Boethius. I am going to go C.S. Lewis Bonhoeffer.
Ooh, well done.
So, so as I think about this in terms of most significant theologian, the end of story, then absolutely not, because as we continue, we see that in the last century, and 20th century here, you have two monumental figures that I think actually only continue to grow and have influence. I mean, I don't know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's been having a moment for a long time, and it actually just sort of seems to continue. And you think of texts like Life Together. If we were to do a poll on our campus, who has read the Summa Theologica, who has read Mere Christianity, who has read Life Together, I think we're going to have far more people in the C.S. Lewis and Dietrich Bonhoeffer camp. And why I think that matters is because these are certainly people who've read and embraced Aquinas. So it's not a denial of what Aquinas offers, but instead it's a building upon. But there are also examples of theologians who were speaking to their time. What Lewis helps us understand about the context of war. What Bonhoeffer helps us understand about the context of, again, like human failing, war, genocide. What's Christians' responsibilities? What is Christians' role? What does relationship with God mean? What does relationship with Christian community mean? So I don't have a whole lot to say other than like, no, because that means that we would have to say there really hasn't been something monumental since, for centuries and centuries and centuries. No.
Well, let's make the case and set that aside for a minute, because I want to just ask you questions as a historian now. How much recency bias is in saying Lewis or Bonhoeffer? And here's what I mean by that: is like, do you think 500 years from now we're still going to be talking about Bonhoeffer and Lewis? I'm in complete honesty, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I think quite possibly, because I think C.S. Lewis, who was living actually in a time with a lot of other extremely influential theologians, I'm trying to think of somebody who, say, in the last 60 years rivals Lewis or Bonhoeffer. Mm-hmm. And I can't, because I think Lewis and Bonhoeffer transcend culture. Mm-hmm. They were very specific to their own culture, and yet at the same time, there's been something in their writing, which would be akin to like Aquinas, mm-hmm. that has been transcendent of culture, denomination, religious.
And they don't seem like they're captive to their context, even though they're writing, like Bonhoeffer especially is writing in a very specific context, Nazi Germany, but he doesn't seem bound to that.
Right.
Now, I will say, as I look at your IMDb page, there's a Bonhoeffer movie in there. Would you ever do an Aquinas movie?
I don't know would there be any women in the Aquinas story?
Sure.
Mrs. Aquinas?
Well, his mom, maybe.
Oh, well, there we go.
He had a mom, right?
I'm over 40 now, and the roles you do get are the roles of
all right.
mothers.
Okay, last question. True will go first. The 14th century is the worst century in human history.
Do you have a preference? Because I do.
I don't.
Oh, really? Okay. Does that mean we can trade?
Yes.
Oh.
We're cheating! Oh, I get to go first, though.
Yes, you do.
True. Okay. I feel like I am on the losing end of a lot of arguments, so I'm trying to play the sympathy card
but you
here.
are totally, that is such a subliminal
Right, no, okay, that's
move.
Because, so here's the thing. Amy's going to make... I actually don't know the case you're going to make. I'm guessing you're going to make 20th century because you have genocide. And I feel like now I'm being dismissive of those things, the atomic bomb, all the anxiety. Yeah. And I think that's a really, 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 really strong case.
Thank you.
So I want to just go over... I want to go over the facts of the case in terms of the 14th century.
Okay.
The 14th century has, to a degree, many of the things... maybe not to the same scale and for the same reasons, but many of the things that you're going to be seeing in the 20th century in Europe. You have a plague which wipes out a quarter to a third of the population of Europe. And it's a global plague. I mean, it's not just in Europe, but that's what our course is looking at, right? I'm going to say those numbers again, a quarter to a third of the population. So look at the person to your left, look at the person to your right. Only one of you makes it through, right? And then that happens within a pretty short period of time. That decimates the population of Europe, right? So you have that. You have things like the 100 Years' War, right? The rise of nationalistic wars. People now going to war for reasons that are political, right? So you do see the rise of wars in the same way you're going to see not the same types of war, but you're going to see people slaughtered in war. The other thing that we're going to see is the breakdown of institutions, of the major institutions. So we're going to see feudalism and manorialism start to really break down. In part through things like the war. I mean, in the 100 Years' War, one of the things that happens, and I realize this is in the 15th century, part of the 100 Years' War, but you're going to see wiping out of big chunks of the French nobility, right? You're going to see the rise of the peasantry there, which you can see as a positive, but you can also see it's a breakdown of a system. When systems break down, that's a problematic time. It's a contested time. And then you really see major crises in the church. I mean, this is the darkest day of the church. Amy, what's the most essential institution in the Middle Ages for life? It's the church, right? So you see that crumble. So it's a really dark time, right?
Yes.
Now, again, I know the case you're going to make, and it's a powerful one, but these are the facts, and they are indisputable.
These are the facts. They are indisputable. It was a terrible century. Deeming it the worst century is, I just think it's just too Eurocentric of an argument, I think. And that is the question. Like, the question says 14th century is the worst century in human history. It doesn't say European history or within the context of the course. So, yes, I'm going to point to the 20th century and to the things that you have already mentioned. So we think about I'm going to start with a little bit more of the obscure. Well, we're going to go Armenian genocide, a sort of little known and more research is emerging and more awareness of the Armenian genocide, the continuation of genocide in Russia, of various populations in Russia, World War I, World War II, even looking at things like the Vietnam War, looking at the role of famine in the 20th century. And then I actually kind of want to it's the 21st century now, and we're only 18 years in, but in the last 7 years, we have seen the worst refugee crisis in human history. And that is indisputable, and those are the facts.
I will say, to be fair, if I get a long 14th century, you can get a long 20th century.
Well, there we go. Yeah, exactly. So, like I said, even if I had to, I think if the question, if we were on Family Feud and it was like, you can't choose the 20th century, I would be like, I'm going to go with 21st if we're really thinking about it, because when we look at the increase in the level of things like human trafficking and sex trafficking. And again, I just even point to the refugee crisis, not just the horrific Syrian refugee crisis, which has not lessened. This is not cleared up. This is not no longer a problem. And to the statistic of looking around you and that, look to your left, look to your right. In Syria, look to your left, look to your right. That is truly 1 in 3 or 2 in 3 have had to leave the country because of political turmoil and then actual threat of.
Yeah, but how has the environment fared in the 20th century?
Very funny. Yeah. Okay, so there we go. So enough said.
All right, so that's our winner there.
Well, actually, say that. That is so. No, because you're making people feel bad for you.
Vote for the 20th century, because what I want you to realize is this is not to say where I brought up recency bias when I was talking about Lewis and Bonhoeffer, just as a question. I don't think that's the case for this. We're not saying, oh, look at us, we're living. It's we need to acknowledge, because we live in a comfortable place, right?
Yes.
But we are living at a time of unbelievable turmoil.
Comfortable for us. And I think that, that's the whole point, is to say, when I hear people reminisce about the good old days, it's maybe for people that looked like you, and I think that's an important point.
Right. So I'm not trying to win votes for the 14th century here. I'm saying we need to acknowledge this.
So students, now it is your turn to make an argument and to discuss. You have a discussion board assignment that is due tomorrow by 10 a.m. You are going to be making a case for or against the Benedict option. Sam, do you want to tell us a little bit about what the Benedict option is, or just refresh it for us?
So this is also written on here, but Chris wrote this, so he's explains stuff better than I do. In recent years,
it's all online.
Yep. But if you'd like to hear it. In recent years, Rod Dreher, a convert from Roman Catholicism to Eastern Orthodoxy, has been arguing that Christians should respond to changes in American culture with what he calls the Benedict option. So we've been talking about Benedictine monasticism.
Saint Benedict. Or we could call it the Scholastica option.
That's true.
But we don't.
When his book on the subject came out, it rocketed to the top 10 of the New York Times bestseller list, and Dreher was profiled in national publications. In short, Dreher thinks contemporary American Christians should follow the example of Benedict of Nursia, who responded to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire by forming new monastic communities that both separate from the larger culture, but not totally cut off, right? We talked about how monasteries really are this really important institution. So the Benedict option would update this historical model of Christian cultural engagement to the 21st century. Christians would focus their energy on building and sustaining distinctive Christian communities. While Dreher insists that this doesn't mean withdraw from the world, he has suggested that Christians pursuing this option might limit or cease their involvement in things like partisan politics, public schools, mainstream media, things like that. So for tomorrow's discussion board post, we want you to play your own make the case for either for or against the Benedict option. Do you think this is the direction that American Christians should take? Based on what you've read and learned about monasticism from the museums, from the videos, from the readings, and figures from early medieval history, what do you think about that as an option? And one important thing here is this is really a discussion, so don't start a whole bunch of new
if somebody
threads.
has already, sort of made this case for why this is a good option, don't then just reiterate your own exact same. Engage it. Support what they're saying, challenge what they're saying, but don't just start multiple threads that are essentially saying the same thing. So, we love discussion board. You guys have been doing a great job with it. So please make sure you vote and make the case. And we will be right back with our last segment.
Well, welcome back to Happy Time. I am here alone. Amy had to run to a meeting. We ran a little long in our taping. I don't know if you noticed in the last segment, she was sort of looking at the clock and looking around. So we're going to wrap this up with some happies. Happy birthday to tennis player Carolyn. Happy birthday to tennis player Carolyn Wozniacki, the number 2 player in the world at age 28. As we film this, Wimbledon is in the round of 16, and Chris asks us, is Wimbledon the best of the Grand Slam tennis tournaments? He asked that to me, and I would say, I think it is. I think Wimbledon is one of my favorites because it always falls around the 4th of July. This is a great moment in sports, especially this summer, because you have the World Cup, you have the Tour de France, and you have Wimbledon, and those are things that are not kind of mainstream sports, right? There's kind of this lull. Baseball season's in the middle. There's a lot that we don't need to pay attention to yet. Football's not here yet. Basketball's over. So I really like Wimbledon in terms of where it falls there. Second, happy anniversary to Kill a Mockingbird, first published on this day in 1960. Harper Lee's classic is a staple of middle school English classes. I will say we just read this book with our kids. My son is 13 and my daughter is 12, and we just read this book together. And I forgot how much I loved this book. So if you haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird, you should read it. If you have read it, you should read it again. I read a lot of American fiction, especially, and I think maybe To Kill a Mockingbird might be the greatest American novel. So if you haven't read it, that's a great summer task. And finally, happy trails to Roman Emperor Anthimus, captured on this day in 472 in St. Peter's Basilica by his own general and beheaded. Chris asks, Sam, there are a lot of executions in the course. Any favorite stories or favorite last words? My favorite one, this sounds weird to say a favorite execution. I really like the execution of Thomas Cranmer, which we're going to get to in Unit 3. He's burned at the stake for opposing the Church of England. And it's a really interesting story. Cranmer's an interesting, complicated guy. It's not a heroic martyrdom exactly, but it's a really interesting story. So look out for that one as we go. All right, time for the big finish. Remember to vote for Make the Case. Remember to go to the discussion boards. Let us know your thoughts on the Benedict option. Really try to listen to what each other's saying, respond to those things. That will make for a better discussion experience for you. It'll make a better discussion board experience for all of us. So for Amy Poppinga and Chris Gertz, I'm Sam Mulberry. Chris, what time is it where you are?